Now, I had a thought for, it's Mr. James Sunday, right? For James Sunday. He was asking, is it possible to ever have a perfectly zero salvage value? And the example occurred to me in the night. So, here we go. When I worked at the nuclear plant, when I am just a young man, and I'm going out with one of the older engineers, and we see a pump just sitting in the floor. It's bolted down, but there are no pipes going to it. And next to it is a newer looking pump. And the pipe did like this. Drip, drip. And you can see that this was in line with the old pump. I said, what's going on here? He says, that pump is retired in place. R.I.P. I said, why is it retired in place? He said, well, it's radioactive, and we are now, we were deep in the bowels of the plant. He said it would cost more to get it out of here and clean it up than it's worth. He said, so we just left it where it was at, and we routed the pipe to the new pump. Perfect zero salvage value. Does that help? Okay. Other questions before we get started? Okay, so let's get back to chapter 21. Come on. Chapter 21, and this is where we left off. We talked about conglomerate acquisitions. Now, I want to make a distinction. I said at the end of class that conglomerate acquisitions are always a bad idea for publicly traded firms. But what if you are the only owner of the firm and you have 100% of your wealth tied up in the firm? What does that tell us about the diversification of your portfolio of wealth? It's really bad, right? And so at that point, the only choice you have to diversify your wealth is to diversify the company. And so from that perspective, if you are the sole owner of the firm, it might make sense to do a conglomerate acquisition just to try to diversify your portfolio. However, if you ever hear a manager of a publicly traded firm say, oh, we're diversifying the firm for the benefit of the shareholders, I want you to know with certainty that that person, come on in, for shame, you're late. I want you to know with certainty that that person is full of crap. And here's why. When you do a merger and acquisition, do you think there might be large costs associated with that? Yeah, you've got millions of dollars worth of legal fees, and you've got to prepare all these disclosures, and there's just all sorts of expenses that go on there. And then if you're having to raise any money, there are flotation costs. And so it's a huge cost for a company to do an acquisition. However, for me, the shareholder, it's really easy for me to diversify my portfolio. How could I do that more cheaply and easily than the company? I'll give you a hint. Can you buy an ETF that mimics the S&P 500? Yeah, boom, right there. You buy that and you're already diversified, right? It's cheap. So don't ever let anyone tell you that they are diversifying the company for the benefit of the shareholders. Now, why would a CEO then diversify the firm in this way? And it comes down to the CEO's wealth. Most of the CEO's compensation is going to be in the form of company stock. And if he's sitting on, or she's sitting on, a bunch of stock, she's got a horribly undiversified portfolio. So what is the only way for her to diversify her portfolio? Diversify the company. Does that make sense? So don't ever buy that argument from a CEO. Now I want to make one more distinction, and that is between related diversification and diversification that's like way out there. For instance, Sara Lee buying Hanes, that's way out there. That first related diversification was when they went into bread. It's not identical, but it's related. So that's somewhere between what we would call the horizontal acquisition and the conglomerate acquisition. Any questions? Okay, let's skip ahead to slide 24. The cost of an acquisition. So the first thing we want to talk about is the incremental gain from an acquisition. If there is no incremental gain from an acquisition, we shouldn't be doing it. By the way, do you remember what incremental cash flows are from chapter 8? Mr. Ingram, what's an incremental cash flow?
That is a cash flow that would only occur if you accept the project.
Right, very good. That's only going to occur if you accept the project. And by the way, you'll look very clean shaven. Okay, back to the story. In my generation, facial hair, it was like if you were very, like from remote areas, or you were going hunting in the winter, that sort of thing. Now people just have facial hair all the time. Very confusing for me. Same with tattoos. Back with the story. Back with the story. Yeah, so I've got someone in my generation with facial hair up
Yeah,
here.
but I have a theory on that. I think it's the influence of our Middle Eastern engagement.
I think there's some of that.
Yeah.
I think there's some of that. I also think that, frankly, I am manly enough to go clean shaven, but some of my younger brothers, they've got to wear a beard to look manly and to be manly. I'm sure that doesn't sell with a lot of you. Okay, back to the story. It's also the same reason I can wear a pink shirt and get by with it. So, incremental gain from acquisition. We've got to be getting something extra out of this. And I hate to hear this when companies say, well, as a result of this merger, our earnings per share will be going up by 40 cents. Well, let me guess. You just took the additional net income and divided it by the number of your current shares, and that's what you've come up with. You paid for those earnings. They're not incremental. What you got to find is where we're going to get additional benefit from putting these things together. It's the old synergy idea. Okay. So we are going to call this incremental gain delta V. Delta meaning change, V meaning value. And then we have V sub AB. V sub AB is the value of the merged firm. V sub AB is the value of the merged firm. V sub A is the value of the bidding firm. V sub A is the value of the bidding firm. And V sub B is the standalone value of the target. By the way, V sub A is the standalone value of the bidding firm. V sub B is the standalone value of the target. What do we mean by standalone? That's the values of these things before the merger is considered. Okay, so if it turns out that the value of the merged firm, if you subtract the sum of the standalone values and you get something greater than 0, then we have synergy. And now you have an argument to start talking about doing an acquisition. VB star is the absolute most that the bidder should pay for the target. VB star, by the way, that asterisk is a star. VB star is the absolute most that a bidder should pay for the target. And how much is that? It would be the standalone value of B plus that incremental gain from the acquisition, delta V. It would be the standalone value of B plus an incremental gain. Now, I'd like to point out to you that if the bidding firm pays out all of delta V to the target shareholders, what does that mean for the wealth gain to their own shareholders from undertaking this project?
It's unchanged.
Yeah, it's unchanged, right? What's the goal of financial management? Maximize shareholder wealth. Now, the CEO of the bidding firm, which group of shareholders is she responsible to? Her current shareholders. She owes nothing to those target shareholders. Those target shareholders, what she wants to do is pay them as little as possible for their shares. Now, we know she's going to have to pay more than the current market value because otherwise no one would sell. right? But she wants to pay as little as possible. And of course, there's the disastrous ones where they end up paying more than VB Star, and then they are actually destroying their own shareholders' value. And we see that one happen too. Okay, so now, what can we say about NPV? We can do NPVs of mergers and acquisitions in exactly the same way that we do NPVs of projects. And what we want to do is figure out the NPV of the project of this acquisition here. And then if it is greater than 0, that means this acquisition is going to increase the wealth of the bidding shareholders and therefore should be undertaken. If it is 0 or negative, we should reject it. But how do we calculate it? Well, we take VB Star and we subtract the cost to our firm to acquire firm B, the target firm. And so if this cost is less than VB Star, then we have a positive NPV project. So when I told you if they paid VB Star, that they would be giving all the wealth to the target shareholders, the NPV would be 0. But if they end up paying more than VB Star, then this is a negative NPV project. As a target shareholder, you would be thrilled for these people to overpay. Right? It's like when I've got a product. By the way, in negotiation, try to never be the first person to throw a number out. Right? So I've got something I want to sell, and I'm thinking it's worth $100. And the person says, how much do you want for it? And I say, what do you think it's worth? And they say, $500. What do? That sounds right to me, right? Does that make sense? So we're thrilled if someone pays us more than we think it's worth, but the bidding shareholders would be really, really mad. Okay, now let's think through this. If I'm the bidding firm and I go out there and I make a bid for the target and it's a positive NPV acquisition, what should happen to my share price? Yeah, it should go up, right? It should go up because we're increasing shareholder wealth. And if it goes down, what is the market saying to me? Oh, come on, if it's that's a negative NPV project. Now, the market, we might say, well, wait a minute, the market, they don't have the same sort of rich information that I do. Oftentimes, the market has way more information than you think, and they also are not afflicted by the biases of the target, or the bidding managers. Remember, if you've read anything on the hubris hypothesis right now, you know that those people are arrogant and they're overly invested in their own skills, and so they think they're going to create more value than they actually are. And in fact, that's how we end up with these negative NPV projects. The bidding managers overestimate the incremental value of the merger. The bidding managers overestimate the incremental value of the merger. And that's why we end up with them being willing to pay too much for the target and for the NPV actually to be negative when they calculate it to be positive.
Are they doing that on purpose when they overestimate it? Or
So there's two thoughts here. Number one is that, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and just say that they're arrogant and ignorant, right? In that case, they're not doing it on purpose. They just don't know any better. But they might also be lying because they want to buy this negative NPV company. And here's why they might want to do that. Remember earlier we were talking about the conglomerate. The reason they want to do that is to diversify their own portfolio. They might be doing that. Also, remember back to chapter 1 with empire building. What if you really, really, really wanted to own a golf club company because you're really into golf clubs? But of course, it's not really your money, but you might go out and say, oh wow, this is a great thing. There's going to be all this great delta V as a result of this project, and therefore we should go ahead with it. As soon as it gets announced, the NPV, or the stock price goes down, we all know that the market thinks the NPV is negative. So those are two ways that we might get to this. Now, what would a good CEO do as soon as the share price crashes upon announcement? Let's say you're the CEO of the bidding firm, and you go out there and you say, I'm going to go buy this golf grips company. And immediately the share price goes down. If you're a good CEO, what do you do? Yeah, oh hey, sorry. Upon further investigation, we determined that the synergies between our two companies weren't as great as first thought, so we're going to have to withdraw our bid for Schmuckco, or whatever it is, right? Does that make sense? Now, what do most managers do?
Double down.
Yeah, because after all, they're so freaking smart, right? And they're going to say, obviously, the market fails to understand the enormous synergies that I, being freaking great myself, will be able to milk from this merger, right? So most of them continue down this path toward destruction. Questions? Okay, so here is our acquisition cost example. We have two firms, Firm A and Firm B. Firm A is the bidding firm, Firm B is the target. Both firms are 100% equity, and we are given that delta V is equal to 100. How do I figure out the standalone value of Firm A? How do I figure out the standalone value of Firm A? They're 100% equity, and we have the share price and the number of shares, right? And so all we have to do is multiply the share price times the number of shares. That tells us that the total market value or standalone value of Firm A is 500. How are we going to find it for Firm B? Price times number of shares, so 10 times 10 is going to tell us that the total market value for Firm B is 100. Now they tell us that Firm B's board will sell for 150, and that can be broken down into the firm's $100 standalone value plus a merger premium of 50. Anything you pay over and above the standalone value is called a merger premium. Anything you pay over and above the standalone value is called a merger premium. Okay, so let's go ahead and figure out what is VB star. What is the absolute most that the bidder should ever pay? Well, it's the standalone value of B, which we calculated to be 100, plus that incremental value, which we have estimated to be 100. And you add those two things together, and you've now got 200. And so VB star is 200. That is the most that the acquirer should ever pay. Now, of course, if they do that, the NPV of this thing is going to be 0, and all the gain from the merger is going to flow to who? There are two groups of people here, bidding shareholders and target shareholders. If the bidding shareholders aren't getting anything and there is gain to be had, who's getting it? It's got to be the target shareholders, right? It's got to be the target shareholders. And every time I give this talk, someone gets confused and think I'm talking about Target, you know, the competitor for Walmart. No, we're just talking about the company that they're trying to buy. Okay, so can we figure out the NPV of this acquisition? Yeah, how can we figure it out?
So VB.
VB star, which is 150. Oh, sorry, which is 200. Which is 200 minus the cost. How much is the cost here? 150. And so we're going to see that the NPV of this acquisition is going to be 50. Do we accept or reject the project? Yeah, we accept it. Why? Yeah, it's greater than 0. It's positive, right? Okay, now the question is, what's the value of the new firm? The way we find the value of the new firm is we take the value of the standalone value of A, and and then we add the NPV of the project, because after all, that NPV is to the bidding shareholders. And by the way, we're gonna pay cash here, right? So I will get to that in a minute. We're paying cash here. The target shareholders are gone, right? In a cash deal, the target shareholders cease to have any sort of interaction with the firm. So we've got this $550 value of the new firm. How many shares are there outstanding in the new firm? How many shares were there to begin with? 25. Now, because we didn't use stock to buy the other firm, we used cash. The number of shares stays the same. The number of shares stays the same. And so I'm going to take that 550 value of the firm, and I'm going to divide it by that 25 shares, and that's going to give me $22 per share. $22 per share. So the stock price goes from 20 up to 22 as a result of making this deal. So that's a good deal. I like that. You get a 10% boost right off the bat. This is the cash acquisition. Let's talk about the stock acquisition. In a stock acquisition, the bidding firm is going to issue additional shares of its stock, and it's going to use those shares of stock to purchase the target firm. It's going to use those shares to purchase the target firm. Now we've got an issue. Before, the target firm shareholders were out of the picture after the deal. But now, what's going on? Are they out of the picture? No, now they're shareholders in this new merged firm. Which means what? It means that we're going to have to now share with these people, because they're always going to own a percentage of the firm. And, oh, by the way, do people like to share good things? No, that's just not human nature. That's why your folks had to teach you to share, because it's just not built into us. Now, the other thing is this. What else might they have to share other than money? Okay, so they're sharing the ownership, and that gives them a share of the money, but it also... Resources. How about control? Right? Beforehand, 100% of the shares were being held among me and my buddies. And now we went out and bought this other firm, and now we have Mr. Salas Hernandez. And he was the only shareholder of the target firm. And now, guess what? He gets to be involved in the decisions of the firm. Now, he may have a small portion. Maybe he's got enough to get someone on the board, right? And so we have to also be concerned not only about sharing the money, but we also have to be concerned about sharing control. Do you think people like to share control? No. If you're in a car, would you rather be driving or riding as a passenger? I would rather be driving, right? And when I'm sitting on the couch at home, do I want me to have the remote control or my wife?
Yes.
All right? I hate romantic comedies. Okay, back to the story. Okay. Now, in a stock merger, we start out by thinking about the value of the firm. And all the value is remaining in the firm in a stock acquisition. In a cash acquisition, $150 worth of value actually left the firm to pay off those target shareholders. But in this case, no value is leaving the firm. And so if we're going to find the value of the combined firm in an all-stock merger, it's really easy. All I do is take the standalone value of A, the bidder, plus the standalone value of B, the target, plus the incremental value. And that all gets combined to tell us what the value of the firm is. It gets combined to tell us what the value of the firm is. Now, at this point, we cannot just divide by 25, the original number of shares, because we had to issue some new shares to give to those target shareholders to get them to tender their shares in their firm. So if we add up, we can figure out our value here is 700. which is exactly 150 more than it was in the cash acquisition, because 150 in cash left the firm under that scenario. Okay, now, the next question is, how many shares did firm A issue in order to buy firm B? Well, they had 150 that they were offering. The shares were trading at $20 per share, so they had to issue 7.5 shares. So now, instead of having 25 shares, we've got 32.5 shares. And someone inevitably will ask, can you actually have half a share? And the answer is yes. My portfolio is littered with partial shares. When these buyouts occur, it's hardly ever like 3 shares for one. It's like 2.5 for one or 1.25 for one. And so we end up with these, so don't let that freak you out. That's all good. So what's the new share price? Well, we take that combined value, 700, and divide by the 32.5 shares outstanding, and we see that those firms, the firm shares, the combined firm shares, are now worth $21.54. What were they worth before the merger? Actually 20. There were 25 shares outstanding. The shares were worth 20. Now they're worth $21.54. Notice that it doesn't go up to the same 22 that went up with the cash acquisition. And the reason is we are having to share those gains over and above what we already gave to the target shareholders in their 150. Now we're having to share those extra gains with the target shareholders because now they're part of the company going forward. So you might think that the true cost of acquiring firm B was just $150, but it's not. It's actually more than that, because we had to give them 7.5 shares that are worth $21.54 a piece. And so I could figure out that I actually had to pay $161.55 for the firm instead of $150. So a stock acquisition actually increases the cost of acquiring the target. So what does that mean to your NPV? Well, the 200 stays the same, that VB star, but your cost to acquire goes up to $161.55, and now our NPV, instead of being 50, is just $38.45. $38.45. Now, keep in mind that that is the NPV to the bidding firm shareholders, the original bidding firm shareholders. If I want to find out what that NPV is on a per share basis, I have to divide by the original number of shares outstanding. And so I'm going to take that 38.45 and divide by the 25 shares that were originally outstanding, and that tells us that the NPV per share is $1.54. If I add $1.54 to that original 20, it comes out to be exactly the same. Our numbers check. If I had done a cash deal, I would have had shares now worth $22. If I do a stock deal, I now have them worth $21.54. So what would that tell you? What would you think that people would prefer? A cash deal or a stock deal? Yeah, I would prefer cash on both sides of it. I would prefer cash on the bidding side because I know that we'll get to keep more of the gains, assuming there are gains. And if I'm a target shareholder, I would prefer cash because, frankly, I'm not all that interested in owning shares of this company. If I were, I would have already owned them. Now, we will see that there is a tax consequence, perhaps, for me receiving cash for those shares, but I would rather do that, me personally, unless it was just some great company that I wanted to own shares in, the bidding firm. Why do you think, then, that firms make stock acquisitions?
They don't have the cash on hand.
Okay, they might not have the cash on hand. If they thought it was a really good deal, what could they do other than issue stock?
Issue debt.
Yeah, they could borrow money, right? They could borrow money. So far, we've just been assuming these are all equity firms, but firms do borrow money to make acquisitions. We talked about junk bonds or high yield bonds in chapter 5. A lot of times, those original issue junk bonds are as a result of someone making an acquisition. Okay, now let's talk about this. If I am the manager of firm A, and I think my shares are actually worth $17 per share, but they're currently trading at 20. Which would I rather do? Would I rather spend my cash to make the acquisition, or would I rather use my stock? Yeah, I want to use the stock because I think the stock is overvalued. Now, if we follow the logic then, what should that say to target shareholders?
That you really don't want that stuff?
You really don't want that stock, or you want to negotiate for more shares for the same number of your target shares, right? It's a signal. It's a signal that the firm's shares are overvalued. Now, as soon as the manager makes the announcement that they're issuing stock in order to take over this firm, what do you think should happen to the share price of the bidding firm? Yeah, it should go down because it's a signal that that stock isn't worth as much as we thought. I'll give you an example. I'm going to roll back to a time before some of you were born. It was in the late 1990s. How many of you were yet to be born in the late 1990s? Oh my goodness, I feel old. Okay, so here's what was going on. We had something called the dot. What the hell?
That's freaky.
That is freaky. Thank God the projector is still on. So this is good. I'm telling you a spooky story here, so we've got the light on. Okay, so it was the 90s. It was a time of experimentation. The time of dial-up modems. You guys don't even know what that is. It's where you'd have to call with your telephone and you go and make this fun noise, and then finally it would stop making the noise, and you're like, I'm online at 56K bits per second, which is
If you were lucky.
which is tiny, right? Only at the time we thought it was scorching fast because the old choice was 14.4.
14.4.
Yeah. Oh, what a pain. Okay, now there's a company called AOL. Mr. Nylon, what does AOL stand for?
I don't remember.
Oh.
I don't remember what it stood for, but I remember they would split stocks like crazy.
Oh yeah, America Online, right? And they would send you these CDs. You guys probably don't even know what those are. They would send you these CDs in the mail, CD-ROMs, and it had the software to get you online, with America Online, and then you too could be part of the internet revolution, right? And AOL stock just kept going up, and they had to keep splitting, keep splitting it. Now, then, here's what always happens, is that managers get to, they think that they're really freaking smart, right? Because they've created this thing that's got a lot of value. But here's what AOL didn't realize. AOL's management didn't realize that the only freaking skill that they had was creating AOL, right? But they think they've got the magic touch. So they go out to make an acquisition. They're like, you know what? We need stuff to put out there online, you know, content. And who has content? Time Warner. Time Warner, they've got all that good Warner film catalog. They've got all this great stuff from Time and Life magazine and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, we need to buy them. And so they go out to buy Time Warner. But do you think they offered cash? Heck no, they offered their stock. They knew enough to know that their stock was overvalued, right? So they go out and they use their AOL stock to take over Time Warner. And it was really fun to watch what happens next, because AOL, not long after that, starts into decline. And in the beginning it was called AOL Time Warner. And then after a while it was Time Warner AOL. Because AOL is shrinking into insignificance, right? And then eventually what happens? Time Warner spins off AOL and sells it to, I forget who they sell it to. I think they just spin it off and then they buy the Huffington Post and some crap, right? Long story short, the managers knew the shares were overvalued, and pretty much the high water mark of those shares was when they bought Time Warner. and then it seems to have just gone downhill from there. So, if you see a brand new high-flying company with a high valuation going out there, offering their stock to make acquisitions, what should you do? Sell. Sell. If you owned Time Warner or AOL at the time, sell, right? Because you know things are getting ready to go sideways. Questions?
Do companies ever tender securities which are not their own to purchase other firms?
It's entirely possible that they could. I can't give you examples. For example, what if they owned a bunch of United States Treasury bonds? They could tender those. Anything of value could be tendered. I'm sorry I don't have a good example for you though. Other questions? I was buying my wife a car. And I like to just write checks for cars. I don't like to, I know it's a bad financial move on my part because I can make better returns on the market, but anyway. So I'm writing a check for this car. And I asked the guy, and it's a nice car. I asked the guy, do a lot of people just write a check for a car? And he says, yes. He says, but, he says, sometimes people bring in duffel bags of cash. He said, I've even had one customer bring in gold bars. And I said, wow, that'd have to be a pain in the butt. He says, actually, it was better than when they bring in the cash. He says, because when they bring in the cash, me and another salesman have to strip down to our underwear and sit in a conference room and count every bit of it. He says, at least with the gold, we just took the guy down to the place, he sold the gold, he got a check, and then I didn't have to take my clothes off. Right? Now, what's my point in telling you that story? If you've got something for sale, you're willing to accept basically anything of equivalent value. And so it makes perfect sense that if you had a bunch of treasury bills, bonds that you no longer wanted, you could use those as your, what are we calling it, to tender. Questions? Okay, we've already covered the first bullet point. Now let's talk about the second, the things to consider when choosing cash or stock. First of all, we know that if we go with stock, we have to share the gains of the merger. And we've said that people don't like to share good things. Oh my goodness. You've got to stop TikTok in class. Put that away. There's nothing good on TikTok. If it is good on TikTok, it will eventually find its way to Instagram. Let Instagram be your filter. Okay, back to the story. We know people don't like to share good things, but do they like to share bad things? Yeah! You ever heard the example of misery loves company? Right? Misery loves company. Oh my goodness. And so if someone is offering stock, it might not only say that they think their shares are overvalued, it might also tell you that they think that this has a negative NPV value, right? Because would you like to share the losses? Oh yeah, I don't want to bear all those losses on my own. Come on over here, friend, right? We can bear these losses together. So that's number one. Number two, taxes. Cash usually results in taxes. Let's talk about who ends up having to pay the taxes, if any. It's the target shareholder. It's the target shareholder. If they pay me more than what I paid for my shares, then I owe something called capital gains tax. And then that extra portion to me is taxable. It's the target shareholder that always ends up bearing the tax burden. Now, my dad has, he only keeps like 12 stocks. He says he can't keep a track of any more than that. And once in a while, one of his companies will get bought out. And I'll talk to him on the phone, and he's really angry. And I'm like, what's up, Dad? And he's like, they bought out my whatever. And I'm like, did they have to offer a premium? He's like, yes. I said, so they gave you extra money? He said, yes. And he said, but I had to pay taxes on it. I said, was the tax rate 100%? He said, no. I said, so you're still better off than you were? He said, yes. Now, here's what, it took me years to figure this out. My dad was planning to exercise the death option on the stock. What's the death option? By the way, my dad's 83. This option's probably in the money for him.
Just sell it at is it a loss?
Well, no. So here's the cool thing. If my dad is holding a stock and he dies and he leaves that stock to me, on that day, my basis for tax purposes is now the share price on the day he died, right? Not the $45 that he paid for it back in the 1990s, it's the $300 that it's worth today, right? And so that's what really annoys him, is the thought of the government getting any single tax money out of that whatsoever. He would rather die than pay taxes. That's what he's really saying, right? Okay. So that's how the taxes can occur from this. The other thing that my dad gets upset about, he's like, now I've got to go find another stock to invest that money in. Because he tries to keep a diversified portfolio of 12. Okay, and then 3, that we've already talked about a bit, is control. Cash doesn't impact control, but shares can. What if right now I own 50% plus 1 shares in the firm, and we're going to go out and make an acquisition? I would greatly prefer that we use cash, because if we use stock, there's a chance now, because I'll have less than 50% of the firm, there's a chance that someone else could come in and buy out the firm, right? And I don't want that. So if you are in one of these situations where control is in question, then we have more incentive to use cash. So which is more popular? Well, usually cash. We've talked about the downside of cash is the taxes, the upside, pretty much everything else. And the other thing is this. If I'm going to go out and issue more shares, it's going to involve the SEC. It's probably going to be an investment bank. Right, there's going to be a bunch of crap involved. If I'm Apple, by the way, what kind of acquisitions does Apple tend to make? Are they big or small? Small. Yeah, they tend to be small. And Apple, the money that they spend on these acquisitions that they make are basically pocket change to them, right? It doesn't make a single bit of sense for them to go out and issue new shares or sell new bonds. And so it makes all the sense in the world that they just go ahead and make those acquisitions with cash. If we look at sheer number, probably it's definitely cash. If we looked at the value, the picture's probably murkier as to which is more popular. Because if you're making a big acquisition, you might prefer to use stock. Questions? Now, we mentioned earlier that it sends a bad signal to use stock. And those 2 signals are, number 1, that the stock might be overvalued. Before the acquisition, the stock might be overvalued. This is the bidder stock. The bidder stock might be overvalued. And the second thing that it may signal is that this is actually a negative NPV project, and these scumbags are looking to share the losses. The second thing is it may be a negative NPV project, and these scumbags, bidding managers, are wanting to share the losses with you. Number 1, shares may be overvalued. The shares of the bidding firm may be overvalued. Number 2, it may be a negative NPV project that they're hoping to share those losses with you. Questions? Okay, now let's go back up. Now you have enough information to do the next homework. So let's go up here and... What's that?
We're going back.
Yeah, we're going back. You didn't think I was just going to skip that good stuff, did you? No. Okay, this is where we left off last time. We got through talking about conglomerate acquisitions. Now let's talk about proxy contest. Remember, the proxy is the right to vote, the votes for a share. And previously we talked about proxy, the ballots that people send in. You can actually give your proxies to someone else. And so the way a proxy contest works is a group is attempting to gain control not by buying the shares, but by getting enough shareholders to agree with them to vote for a board of directors that thinks the way they do. So then that board can hire the CEO they want. Now, the cool thing is it sounds really good. It's cheaper than buying the shares. It's cheaper than buying the shares because after all, if you go and buy the shares, you have to pay the share price. In this case, my only cost is whatever it costs me to convince people to let me vote their shares. The other thing that's going on here now, and it was a discussion article, is this idea of being able to buy people's votes on a market. That makes proxy contests a whole lot easier to succeed, but a little more expensive to attempt. Does that make sense? Because now I have to not just convince these people, I've got to pay for the votes. But are people more convinced when they get money? Absolutely they are. Okay, now it can be difficult to succeed. And here's why. In order to convince these people, I have to know who they are. And I have to be able to get a hold of them. Who did we say has the mailing list for the shareholders? Yeah, the firm. Do you think they're going to be really willing to give that up? No. Yeah, and that's why, and so what we have to do now is we go back to the same thing we did with the tender offer. We do the PR Newswire press release. We also go to the brokers and talk to them, but we try to get the word out, what we're trying to accomplish at the company. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. By the way, most of these fail. I'm going to give you an example of one that was successful, and I'm going to give you an example of one that in theory failed but actually succeeded. The first one has to do with Darden restaurants. Are you guys familiar with Darden restaurants? Do you know Olive Garden? Yeah. So the Olive Garden, Red Lobster, Longhorn Steakhouse, Smoky Joe's Bones or Smoky Bones Barbecue or some crap like that. Anyway, so these restaurants are owned by Darden. And there was a group, by the way, we're not doing good. That's usually the first thing before a proxy contest or any sort of takeover is that the company's not doing well. And here's what was going on. Actually, a group called Starboard Capital, they went out and they sent their people out into these Darden restaurants to figure out what was going wrong, because Olive Garden had been a money-making machine, and now things were just starting to deteriorate. And so what they figured out was a couple of things. Number one, Olive Garden has this formula for breadsticks. Anybody here ever been to the Olive Garden? If you go, and it's two people, how many breadsticks do they bring? 3. I never knew this was actually a company policy. And this is, 20 years ago, I used to eat at the Olive Garden. And they would bring us the breadsticks. And it was me and my wife, and they bring us 3 breadsticks. And I look at the server and I say, are you trying to start a fight? Right? Because we're going to fight over that 3rd breadstick. And even if I manage to tear it in half, one of those halves is likely going to be larger, right? This is how marital problems start. So, I'd say bring us an extra breadstick, please. And she would. It wasn't a problem. Now, they've got a formula. It's called N+1. If there are 6 people at the table, how many breadsticks do they bring? 7. Now, what does this lead to, though? It means that the server has to keep an eye on your table, and they have to keep bringing you breadsticks. Now, if you're a server, do you want to, A, have to keep an eye on the table, and B, have to keep the breadsticks? No. So what happens? By the way, these things are really greasy. You're just like grabbing gloves of those greasy sticks and throwing them in a basket, and they're like, here you go, you pigs. And they just leave it on the table. Now, first of all, do those breadsticks taste good after they're cold? No, they're nasty. And the grease congeals, it's really bad. Number 2, what do you think that means for the amount of food waste as a result? Yeah, and so these people were actually digging through the Olive Garden's garbage and just finding breadsticks galore. By the way, perfectly fine to dig through people's garbage, it's in the public domain, right? So if you ever do corporate intelligence, perfectly fine. Now, be prepared to be called out by people that happen to see you digging through it, but just pretend that you're homeless. Back to the story. The other thing they figured out is that the Olive Garden had bought these pots to boil their pasta in, and the warranties on the pots said, if you use salt, your warranty is void. Anybody in here know how to cook pasta? Do you put salt in the water? Yeah! Everybody does! Because if you don't, the pasta sucks. So the correct decision was, put the salt in the water, make good pasta, and if you need to, then replace the pots at your own cost instead of the warranty. But no, that's not what the Olive Garden was doing. They weren't salting, and their pasta tastes like crap as a result. By the way, it also changes the texture and the stickiness and all that other kind of stuff. Okay, so the Olive Garden was doing things poorly. Starboard Capital actually comes out and posts, here is our plan for improving the Olive Garden. And if you agree with our plan, please vote for this slate of directors at the next shareholder meeting time, right? It worked. It worked. They actually convinced enough people and institutions to pledge their votes to this new board that they were able to take over the board and change out the management of Olive Garden. And I ate at Olive Garden for the first time in a long time just the other day. And do you know how many breadsticks they brought to the table? N+1, right? They succeeded. So that's a story of a proxy battle that succeeded. Let's talk about one that appeared to have failed, but actually succeeded. Usually proxy fights are about trying to get rid of a bad CEO. And let's roll back to the year, I think it's 1984 or so. And I remember on Sunday nights after 60 Minutes was over, The Wonderful World of Disney would come on. And if my dad was out in the yard, I'd get to watch that. If he was inside, we'd watch something else. Okay, so I'm watching it, and it's my mom's cleaning up in the kitchen, and this guy comes on the screen. He says, hello, my name's Michael Eisner. I'm the new CEO of Disney. And I'm like, And I listened to him talk for a little bit, and I'm like, Mom, come see this guy. She comes and sees him. I'm like, he's going places. This guy, he's got it, right? I'm 12. What do I know, right? I'm like, that guy, he's got it. And sure enough, over the next few years, Michael builds all sorts of value for Disney shareholders, all sorts of value. Now he made a few missteps. There was Euro Disney. By the way, if you want Disney to be successful in Europe, you have to have wine, and everyone eats at noon, right? And these are things that Americans didn't know. But eventually they managed to make that work out. Lots of other things that he gets into that make Disney a lot of money. Now, here's a question I'm going to ask Mr. Nylon since he knows how this works. As you get older, do you find yourself being more and more ambitious?
No.
No. You find yourself being less and less ambitious. And in fact, what we call it seeking the quiet life. And so you'll see CEOs that get out there when they're young punks, you know, a little older than you, but younger than me. They're going to be out there kicking butts and taking names and growing the company, taking risks, working their tails off, right? But you get into this range and you're like, you know what I'd really like? A nap, right? And so then Michael was doing this. This was what Michael Eisner was doing at the firm. Now, at the time, there was one member of the Disney family left on the board, a man named Roy Disney. Roy Disney was referred to affectionately within the firm as Walt's idiot nephew. Now, why do you think Walt's idiot nephew has a place on the board? In a way, right? Because the family has shares. That's how Roy gets on the board. Now, Roy rightfully points out that Michael's been doing a crap job with Disney as of late, and Roy wants to get rid of Michael Eisner. And so they do a proxy contest. And 43% of the shares vote for Roy Disney's slate of directors. 57% vote for the pro-Eisner set of directors. Has Eisner won? Technically, he has. But here's what happens next. The board gets together, and they're like, whew, that was a lot closer than we thought. If this thing continues to go as it is, next time we might not be so lucky. And by the way, the slate of directors that Roy is proposing doesn't include the current clowns that are on the board, right? Did we talk about directors wanting to keep their jobs on boards? Absolutely, it's a sweet gig. And so what are they going to do? They're going to try to figure out how they can keep their jobs. So what do? They call Michael in. And they say, Michael, we as a board would like to thank you for all the value you have created at Disney. You've done a great job. Michael's like, well, of course I have. And then they say, you know, you have all sorts of valuable insights, skills, knowledge, wisdom that we just cannot do without here at Disney. Michael says, go on. They say, here's what we'd like to do. We know you would like to spend more time with your grandkids. And so here's what we propose. We want to get a new CEO in training. A CEO in training. And you can bring them up in the Michael Eisner way over the next 2 years. And you'll hand your responsibilities over to them one at a time until finally after 2 years is over, they will now be the CEO. But we cannot allow you and your valuable insights to go away. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to pay you a multi-million-dollar consulting contract per year after that to remain available to the board should we need your wisdom and insights, which we're sure we will, right? Now, what does Michael actually hear out of all this? You're fired, right? But what does he do? He takes it, right? And he then, like 2 years later, I see him, he's on like Good Morning America, and they're talking to him. And they ask him, so what are you doing with your time these days? He's like, oh, I'm writing a children's book. By the way, apparently everyone can write a children's book. I'm writing a children's book. I love to spend time with my grandkids and this, that, and the other. If they had at that point said, hey, Disney just called, they would like you back as CEO, what do you think you would do? Bam! He'd be right back there, right? He didn't want to leave. But it was a graceful way for him to leave. It was a graceful way for the directors to dump him, and a great way for the directors to keep their jobs. Questions? Most proxy fights don't even get that level of success. Now let's talk about going private. When you sell shares in a firm for the first time, it's an IPO, we call that going public. After a while, you may decide that you want to go private. And this is where a group of investors get together, and those group of investors usually involves the managers, and they buy the open shares, the shares on the open market, in order to take the company private. So it's just the opposite of an IPO. Now, most of these managers are not people that have great individual wealth. They're people like me who just happened to work their way up through and went to some school and worked hard, and then they're in this position. And so they don't really have this money to go out and buy the firm. So what can they do? They can actually borrow the money to buy the firm using the assets of the firm as collateral. And you say, wait a minute, how can I use something I don't yet own as collateral for a loan? Mr. Nylon, have you ever bought in a house using the house as collateral?
No.
You've never had a mortgage?
Oh, you talking about a lien on the house? Yeah.
Yeah, a mortgage, right?
Yeah.
It's like a freaking mortgage. You are borrowing money against an asset you don't yet own. And it's the same way when you go out to buy a car. You're borrowing money against an asset you don't yet own. And so it's perfectly fine for these people to go out and they sell junk bonds, and the junk bonds, the collateral for them, or the security for them, is the assets of the firm. Okay, so that's where the money comes from. Now, this is usually done with debt, and so we call it a leveraged buyout, or an LBO. Now, because the managers are involved, sometimes we call it an MBO. Now let's talk about how this actually creates value. Let's talk about a CEO. In fact, let's use a specific CEO. The CEO of RJR Nabisco. RJR Nabisco. This guy started off in Winnipeg, Canada, delivering newspapers from his bicycle. and he ended up being CEO of this huge conglomerate that made both Oreo cookies and cigarettes. That's the RJR part, was the cigarettes. Okay, now, by the time he gets to be in charge, the company is basically a cash cow. It's spitting off lots of cash. That cash, who does it belong to?
Shareholders.
Shareholders. And so he should be paying out dividends. He should be doing repurchases, but instead, he's wasting money on all sorts of perks for himself and his friends. He is investing money in this smokeless cigarette. And so there's a movie called Barbarians at the Gate. And if you go out to YouTube, I think you can find it, Barbarians at the Gate. And one of my favorite scenes is where he's visiting the laboratory where they're developing this cigarette. And they say, he says, how's it going? And they say, well, we've had some negative feedback. And someone says, or he says, well, what's the negative feedback? And he says, someone says, well, some people think it smells like a fart. And he says, smells like a fart. And he's like, give me one. He lights it up. He says, oh, he says, smells like a fart, tastes like shit. He says, what a great marketing line. And he says, you boys have spent enough money to put a cigarette on the moon. And this is what we had to show for it? So this was some of the wasted money. And then, of course, there were acquisitions and some other crap. Now, so what do? It turns out that an investment banker approaches this guy and says, hey, would you like to be the owner of RJR Nabisco? Well, yeah. He says, well, but I don't have any money. And then he explains to him about using the collateral, the firm's assets as collateral for these junk bonds. Now, long story short, this one doesn't end up happening the way that he had hoped. Someone else ends up buying out the firm because the firm was now in play, which we'll talk about that later on. But here's what you need to know out of this. Let's assume that he did succeed. He's going to have a big party. There's going to be lots of champagne. And then the next morning, he's going to wake up and he's going to say, oh man, I've got a headache. But it's not just because of the champagne. Why do you think he has a headache the next morning? How did he pay for the firm? Debt. The debt has a coupon due in 6 months. By the way, it's high yield debt. How big is the coupon? Flippin' huge, right? And so he immediately, he shows up the next morning to work at like 7 a.m. And his assistant is like, this is the first time I've seen you this early in like 15 years. And it's because he's got to figure out what he's going to do to keep the company alive for the next 6 months after and pay this coupon. We call this the disciplining effect of debt. The disciplining effect of debt. In fact, let's talk about the 1937 film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Have you seen it? Okay, Snow White's living with the seven dwarfs. What do the dwarfs do for a living?
Mining.
Yeah, they're miners, and they take off in the morning and they sing a song. What's the song? Hi ho, hi ho, it's off to work we go, right? Okay, here's the disciplining effect of debt. I-O, it's off to work I go. That's the disciplining effect of debt. It was kind of funny, my father-in-law, he's a very smart man. And he wanted my mother-in-law to keep working. And she wanted a new car. And so he's like, well, hey, just borrow the money and what does that car payment make her do with her job? Stay there, right? Does that make sense? There are a lot of times that people will stick around doing stuff because they've got bills they've got to pay, right? That's a disciplining effect of debt. Now, how does that impact a CEO? Well, all that stupid crap that he was doing before, throwing these huge, magnificent parties, you think that goes away? Absolutely. What about selling divisions that are underperforming that he just bought because he thought they sounded cool? Yeah, like the golf grips. That's going to go away. And he's going to go through, and you think he's going to cut down on selling general and administrative expenses? Absolutely. He's going to do all the things he should have been doing to begin with. Does that make sense? And the reason he's doing it is because of the agency problem. Who's 100% responsible now? Who bears 100% of the benefit of his efforts? He does! Who bore the benefits of his efforts beforehand? The shareholders. Does that make sense? Are people scumbags? Absolutely. Now let's talk about alternatives to mergers. There is the strategic alliance, and this is something you ask about. And this is where two companies decide to work together for their common good. Now, they're not actually forming a new company. They're not actually investing in assets together, but they are working together for their common benefit. So, the biggest one that you see in any textbook are the airlines. Airlines tend to get into these strategic alliances. So, there's Delta is a member of SkyTeam, right? SkyTeam is a collection of airlines, and how does that matter to you as a consumer?
It doesn't dictate what flights you have access to at certain airports.
Okay, so if you're flying on Delta, then it's likely that you'll be continuing on KLM or one of these other members of the SkyTeam. What else does it mean to you? How about as a frequent flyer? If I earn miles on KLM, I can use them on Delta. If I earn miles on Delta, I can use them on Virgin Atlantic, right? Because they're all part of that same alliance. Does that make sense? Okay, now, why do airlines want to do this? Well, it's good to be able to keep things within the family, right? So, and if I'm not part of this alliance, chances are I'm going to be at a competitive disadvantage. And of course, there's not just one alliance, right? There's One World, that is American Airlines, and there's SkyTeam, which is Delta, and then there's Crab Sandwich, which is United. I don't think that's the actual name, but it is. Now, long story short, it gives them other benefits too. Let's think about this. It's 1998. I'm sitting at my desk in Dallas, Texas. The phone rings, and they say, go home, grab your passport, pack yourself a week's worth of clothes, and go to the airport. We've got a ticket for you. You're going to go to our plant in Arbroath, Scotland. And I'm like, cool, right? So I call the wife, tell her what's up. I go home, pack my bag, grab my passport, I head to the airport, flying on American Airlines. And we get over there to London Gatwick. And now I'm looking for my connection flight. And my stuff says AA 4198. And so what am I doing? I'm looking for American Airlines. Well, the truth is it's a code share, right? It's actually a British Airways flight. Now, why would they do that? Here's the trick. Is it worth Americans' time and money to build out a fully national network within the United Kingdom? No. Is it worth British Airways' time and money to build out a national network inside the United States? No. So what can they do? They can agree to work together to kind of hand off passengers back and forth between each other. It's to their mutual benefit. Okay. Another strategic alliance I can think of is between the big three automakers here in the U.S. I think at least three of them were in on it, or two of them, maybe all three. And it was to develop a 10-speed automatic transmission. This has been really relatively recent. If you have a new vehicle with a 10-speed transmission in it, you can probably thank this strategic alliance. And here's what they figured out. Is the transmission typically a competitive advantage for your regular run-of-the-mills car? No. People don't care that this transmission was co-developed with General Motors. They just don't care, right? Now, if you're buying different kinds of cars, for instance, both the vehicles that my wife and I own have transmissions made by ZF in Germany, but I'm a nerd. That's the only reason I know that, right? But most people just don't care. And so they work together to develop this 10-speed automatic transmission. That's a strategic alliance. And of course, they manufacture their own versions of it, but the development work was where the strategic alliance happened. Now let's move on to the joint venture. The joint venture is where both companies, let's say two, it could be more, but they put up assets or expertise and they run this thing together. It's a separate company, this joint venture, and then they share the profits of it, and when it's done, they basically split up the assets. I was actually semi-involved in a joint venture at Halliburton. If you think back to the end of the Cold War, the Russians pulled back. I know it's not the directions you're used to seeing Russians head, but they pulled back to the old Soviet Union, and when they did, they had a bunch of leftover trucks. People don't realize this, but Russia is one of the largest oil producers on the planet. They've got more reserves than Saudi Arabia and the United States combined. I mean, it's huge. But what we know is that under Marxist, communist, socialist systems, they have underinvestment, and so the oil wells were in a bad way. I work for Halliburton. What do? We help people fix oil wells. But we couldn't get directly in there and work with them, but what we could do is go into a joint venture with a guy who had bought a bunch of these Russian army trucks. And so we had a bunch of old pumps, which is one of the ways that you help fix an oil well. We had a bunch of old pumps. We didn't have any trucks to put them on in Russia. He had a bunch of old trucks. He didn't have any pumps. And so we put those assets together, and we buy a building in Russia, or we lease it, and then we are in a joint venture with him until we run out of trucks, or trucks, pumps, whichever comes up first. And then who do they sell these to? To the mom and pop operations that were springing up, because when you take away a communist, socialist, Marxist system, what springs up in its place? Capitalism, entrepreneurs, right? It's part of our natural human spirit just to start up and do stuff, right? And so that's exactly what was happening. And so we were able to sell these trucks to these people. When it was all done, then we split the remaining assets and went our separate ways. But while it was happening, we shared the profits from that venture. Now, I do want to tell you a cultural point here, and that is about how deals get sealed in Russia. My buddy Andy was in charge of setting this thing up. He's a guy from rural Oklahoma, right? Hasn't been very far away from home, and they pick him up and they send him to Russia, and he comes back and he looks awful. He just looks absolutely awful. I'm like, Andy, you look like you just escaped from a prisoner of war camp. I said, what happened to you over there? He says, do you know how Russians close business deals? I said, no. You have an idea? Okay, you're right. So there's lots of vodka involved. Do you think we're all just going to get together, drink vodka, and pass out? Oh, no, man. Something else that Russians like to do together is sauna. You know the sauna? Okay, so they will get drunk, strip naked, which usually isn't a big thing that Oklahoma people want to do. So goes in, strip naked, and then they beat each other with tree branches. They beat each other with tree branches, drink some more vodka, and then they run outside and plunge into the lake, and it's flipping freezing cold. This is how you close a business deal in Russia. And this is why Andy looked like he was nearly a corpse when we got him back, because that was just like too much for him. Anyway, I usually have at least one person in the class who can vouch for that, but unfortunately we don't have any Finns or Russians in the class today to be able to do that. You can go back and look at some of my prior live show videos, and you can hear.
Germans do that for fun, except for the beat each other with branches.
You do that for fun?
They do that for fun, yeah. They
Oh.
put those hot signs and then come out and get ice.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, and the beating each other with branches sounds like a punishment, but it's actually like willow branches, and they're trying to open up their pores to release the poisons or whatever. Whatever, right? Not going to get me to do that. Okay, I will give you one more example of a strange custom, and then we will leave for the day. I had a buddy that worked for GE, and he went to China to seal a deal. And in order to seal the deal, he either had to drink snake blood or sing karaoke. What do you think he ended up doing? He sang karaoke, and he was so good they invited him back the next night. I'll see you guys next time. If you like today's show, please feel free to like, subscribe, and share.